Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and on this edition of L'Chaim, I have the pleasure of sitting with a rabbi who's made an enormous contribution to Jewish life in the Washington, D.C. community, as well as on the national Jewish scene. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Stuart Weinblatt, rabbi of Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Potomac, Maryland, a conservative congregation he helped to found back in 1988 with but a few families at that time. It now has over 650 families. Stuart Weinblatt has also served as the president of the Rabbinic Cabinet of the Jewish Federations of North America. And he has a long history of service and leadership within the Rabbinical Assembly, the national organization of conservative rabbis, having served as director of Israeli policy and advocacy, and also having served as a past chair of the RA's National Convention. Stuart has done so much in so many areas of life. When he was a student at the University of Maryland, he created the first Jewish Studies program. He's affiliated with the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem as a senior rabbinic fellow, and he's a prolific writer of poems, articles, and op-ed pieces, often on issues relating to the state of Israel. His first book was a collection of his sermons called God, Prayer, and Spirituality, a beautifully written book. And Stuart recently published his second book, a powerful personal account of his battle with cancer, entitled Living in the Shadow of Death, A Rabbi Copes with Cancer, published by Kitav, available on Amazon. But perhaps the most important thing you should know about Stuart Weinblatt is that he has earned the respect, admiration, and affection of his rabbinic colleagues throughout America. And Stuart, it is wonderful to have you sitting at this table. Thank you for joining us.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you.
There are so many things I want to talk to you about. I want to begin about one just interesting dimension of your own personal rabbinic career. Yeah. You are the rabbi of one of the most successful conservative congregations in America, but you received your ordination. Your smicha comes from HUC, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, the Reform Movement's rabbinical school. So how does somebody who is ordained a Reform rabbi end up founding what is now one of the leading conservative congregations, and you're part of the RA, the Rabbinical Assembly, which is, again, the conservative organization of rabbis. How does that happen in terms of your personal journey?
A lot had to do with where I was in terms of my, as you say, personal journey. It was in 1988 that I started B'nai Tzedek, a conservative synagogue outside of Washington, D.C. in the Potomac area. We had just a handful of families. There were people who had said to me that they wished I was out in the Jewish area, which is Bethesda, Potomac, Rockville.
But you already are an ordained rabbi.
But I was an ordained Reform rabbi. I had been serving in Bowie, Maryland, which was outside of Washington but closer to Annapolis area. And there were a number of issues that I really was grappling with at the time.
Let's hear. What is it?
Okay. How honest can we be? First of all, at the end of the day, one of the foundational issues of Reform Judaism, even as it begins to move and has moved over the years to be a bit more traditional, is the notion of individual autonomy. And that every Jew has the right to make his or her own choice. And that's a bedrock of Reform Judaism. I felt that was really not quite as consistent with my understanding of the emphasis upon community. And so that was one of the reasons that, on a theological perspective.
I'll take a step back for me. When you grew up, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a Reform temple at Baltimore Hebrew. So I grew up in Pikesville, Maryland, which was a very Jewish area. And I was under the impression one could be traditional in the Reform movement. But I found that it was increasingly lonely, especially at that time at least.
Okay. As you grow up, what kind of Jewish home do your parents create for you?
Okay, so Friday nights was, we lit Shabbat candles. We did have a kosher home, again, even though it was, we were affiliated with the Reform movement. And so there were a number of positive Jewish experiences. I went to a Jewish summer camp.
Which one?
I went to Habonim Camp Moshava, outside of Annapolis, Maryland. And so I had some number of positive influences, and certainly my grandmother, who was an old true bubby in every sense of the word, had an impact upon my appreciation and love of Yiddishkeit. Oh, you know what? There was an important factor. In my last year of college, when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do, and especially looking back now, I realized I graduated in May of 1974. In October of 73, with the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War and Israel's very existence so tenuous and so perilous, I realized that if there was a way in which I could make a difference and make a contribution, because to me the survival of Judaism and the Jewish people was more important than anything. I was very involved in political things. I'd worked on Capitol Hill. I had run a campaign for someone who was running for the Maryland state delegates. I lobbied the Maryland state government on behalf of the students at the University of Maryland. So I could have very easily...
And you created the first Jewish Studies program.
And while I was a student there, I also created the Jewish Studies program.
Amazing.
So
you were a very involved, active Jew, really from high school on, yes?
I was involved, but I never imagined I would be a rabbi.
Really?
Yeah, it was the last year, the last semester. I had a professor of Judaic studies of Bible. His name was Dr. Sam Avery of blessed memory, and he was the one who said to me, you know, maybe you should think about becoming a rabbi. And so it wasn't something hadn't even occurred to me.
What were you going to be?
I was going to go into law. I was going to maybe go into a political realm
Yes.
and take that kind of a route. But then I stopped and I realized all the things a rabbi gets to do are things that I love doing. I love teaching. I love studying. I love the opportunity to speak and to influence people, to be involved in issues that I care about. I love counseling. And so with all of that,
Perfect. Yes, and so why HUC as opposed to JTS? Because you have already indicated you grew up, although in a Reform household, you certainly were comfortable with the more traditional end of the Jewish spectrum.
Right. So first of all, it was what I was familiar with. Second of all, I thought that because of individual autonomy, I could choose to do whatever I wanted to. And actually I was turned off by the fact that at that time especially, for so many people, they wanted in the conservative movement, the rabbi to be the vicarious Jew.
Absolutely.
So that we don't have to do it, but Rabbi, you should do the Jewish stuff for us. I was turned off by that. But after having been 2 years in a large synagogue in Miami, and then 7 years in a synagogue which on my own outside of Washington in Bowie, I just came to feel that also, in addition to what we were talking about before, it leaves out too much of tradition. I just remember speaking with young people who had no concept of the importance of Judaism, of Jewish tradition. And so I felt that within the conservative movement, I would be more comfortable also within the context of its stance about Israel and of Zionism, which was very, very supportive in many ways. And so from all
But by
of
the time you're at HUC, the Reform movement also is becoming very pro-Israel.
Oh, for sure.
Did you spend, by the way, the first year in Israel?
Spent the first year in Israel.
Yes.
That's where I met the woman who eventually became my wife.
Simcha.
Yeah, right.
And I just want to everybody understand, it was the Reform movement who, before JTS, was requiring entering rabbinic students to spend the first year in Israel.
Unquestionably, a love of Israel came from the upbringing that I had, and growing up in a Reform congregation, which was very committed. My rabbis were very committed to Israel. But what was happening in the late 80s, as I said, was just this sense on my part that a desire to have a bit more within the context of what it was that I was passing on, what it was that we were living, and I believed in the importance of mitzvot. And within the context of where Reform Judaism was then, where conservative Judaism was then, I felt that would be a place where I'd be able to express that more.
It's a very lovely story. The one thing I don't want to leave the impression of that either you or I think that the only place Jews want the rabbi to be the vicarious Jew for them is the conservative movement.
Right.
It is as true in Reform Judaism, and although it's a different style in Orthodoxy, even the Orthodox movement at times, people want the rabbi to be much more Jewishly observant than they're willing to be.
Right. I think it's one of our challenges is the disconnect and to try and bridge that gap. You know, to be a rabbi in many respects, for exactly the reasons you're mentioning, can be a very lonely position.
Has the rabbinate been for you what you'd hoped it would be? Have there been any major disappointments for you, not necessarily in what your own experience has been, but what you believe the American rabbinate is?
Look, I think it's a tremendously gratifying experience to be a rabbi. I've had the chance to do the kinds of things that I really care about. I've had the chance to bring my passion and for Israel, for Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people to bear. And every day is different. There may be a morning when I'll be teaching a class, then meeting with someone to counsel them on an issue of personal concern, and then down at Capitol Hill lobbying on an issue of concern to the Jewish people. So I think it's a very fulfilling kind of existence as a rabbi. In terms of disappointments, I think the biggest challenge is how do we get people to realize and to appreciate what we understand? And that is the vitality, the vibrancy, the relevance of Judaism. That really is what I think about
Good
tremendously.
For you. You know, in this wonderful collection of your sermons, God, Prayer, and Spirituality, the very first one is entitled, What I Love About Being Jewish.
Yeah.
Now, this is not fair to you, but so what? You know, al regel achat,
Yeah.
in summation, if you had to do it in 60 seconds, what is it that you love about being Jewish?
Well, I think there's so many aspects to it, but one of the things, a few of the things that I tried to capture in that essay there were, I love the fact that Judaism encourages us to ask questions, and it doesn't always hold the answer. I think that in many respects, in many religions, things are either black or white or gray, and Judaism, I think, often says, no, it's black and it's white. And the creative tension of living between that polarity. So as a result, I think it's an intellectually sophisticated religion. One of the things, by the way, that gets to me is when somebody would say, oh, Judaism or the Bible or the Talmud was made up by a bunch of guys a long time ago, and just would discount it like that. It is so rich and so fulfilling. So intellectually, I love the challenge, the questioning, and that aspect of Judaism. Secondly, on a spiritual and emotional level, there can be such wonderful highs that we can get and experience out of Judaism. And thirdly, I think in terms of being a part of this unbelievable culture and people, the pride that we take in terms of what we've been able to contribute to the world, what we've been able to contribute within the context, both secular Jews and through the Jewish literature and as well. So from all of that, you put that together, I think it's exciting. I think it's fun to be a Jew. I love our sense of humor and the fact that we have a wonderful way of looking at life as well. So as a rabbi, I try and convey that. Why be Jewish?
So what's it like being a rabbi in the shadow of the nation's capital? It's not just that you're a rabbi, not just that you're a rabbi in a major conservative congregation. You're in a major conservative congregation, a major Jewish congregation that's part of the Capitol Hill community. Yeah. What's that been like?
So you know what, first of all, it makes me a better rabbi because I know that the congregation is a sophisticated congregation, yes. Number one. Number two, it makes me a better rabbi to be in that kind of an environment because of the fact that I know that you can't just talk about the issues of the news of that day because people have already known it and processed it and so on. But if I may digress for a moment, when the whole affair with President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky broke, it was right shortly before the high holidays. By the way, I happened to be at the White House that night for a private tour from a member of my congregation. So you ask what it's like, you have those kinds of opportunities. And all of a sudden is when all hell broke loose. And there were the TV cameras and everything. So shortly thereafter, the Ken Starr report was going on and so on. So I knew half the congregation probably did not want to hear about this whole thing. But I knew that the other half probably was anxious to hear something. So I gave a sermon and I called it the bit of Bill, Ken, and Monica in each of us. So I spoke about it, but without speaking about it. In other words, I used what was in the news that people were aware of, and I spoke about Bill Clinton in terms of how sometimes we disappoint and let down friends. Ken Starr at the time, he was being just so tenacious. Sometimes we don't know how to let go of things. And Monica Lewinsky in terms of her being a nice Jewish girl, but who obviously didn't have any Jewish values. And so I used that. So it was a way to take something that people were aware of and were thinking about, and then put it into a Jewish context. So that's the way I often will try and phrase and frame some of my sermons, to put it in a way in which we can think about it. Now, the other thing is there are certainly opportunities, whether it is in terms of not just the usual ones of the opportunities to interact with members of Congress and staffers and things like that, but also some of the fascinating interactions can be with ambassadors. And so there, in a quiet way, one can have an opportunity there to also effectuate advancing of Jewish causes. Shortly after, if you recall, a couple years ago, there was the fires in Israel that ravaged in the north. And there were a number of countries who immediately sent help to Israel. And so what I did was I went with a colleague, Rabbi Jack Molina, and we took and we made presentations. We planted trees for each of the nations that came to help Israel, and we met with each of the ambassadors, including the ambassador of Egypt, the ambassador of Jordan, because those countries go, even with Palestinian Authority ambassador to the United Nations, to the United States. And especially, actually, the one with Turkey was fascinating because it was right after the beginning of the breaking up the relations there. When we went to meet with the ambassador of Turkey, he was so proud of this certificate. It's the kind of that I'm sure many of your listeners probably have, and I don't know what they do with them, but you all know that we have more than a ton of. But he was so proud of this that he decided he was going to put it in a place of honor right next to his picture when he presented his credentials to President Bush. So I said to him, that's very appropriate because they've got the tree next to the bush. So.
Very good. To what extent do you find your congregation leans liberal?
Interestingly, I would have to say not probably as liberal as the overall sense in the American Jewish community.
Why is that? The notion we would have is all these Jewish congregations in the Washington, D.C. area are liberal, Democrat, strong in that regard, and the question only becomes how left is a Jewish congregation in Washington. So how do you describe the makeup, and how do you think it happens?
I think it's a couple of things. First of all, because of the fact that within the community, both locally and as you mentioned nationally, I'm often known for being a passionate advocate for Israel, and as a result, it becomes self-fulfilling in the sense that there are people who are attracted to our congregation, people who come there and who are involved in those kinds of issues.
They know the stands you take.
And I'm not afraid to take them, exactly. Mm-hmm. And not everyone's always going to agree. I mean, we can come back to, I'll mention to you about the Iran situation, what we did with that. But I think that rabbis sometimes, there's this big conversation these days about whether or not rabbis can or should speak about Israel and whether or not they're afraid to speak about it. And it's usually somebody who's on the left who says we're afraid to speak about it. Whatever. Sometimes there are people on the right as well.
Absolutely. The people I hear more frightened are people who want to take a more centrist position and feel that their congregation is very liberal and that the congregation is going to be upset that the rabbi isn't liberal enough.
Yes, I think there's a lot of that as well, absolutely. So I think, let me put in a few contexts, Mark. First of all, I think one of the roles of the rabbi is to be an advocate for mitzvot, regardless of what movement you're in, okay? And one of those mitzvot is the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel. And I think that some rabbis make the mistake sometimes of making their criticism of Israel louder than their expressions of love. And I always want to make sure that the expressions of love are heard. Also, people hear more than enough in the media, whether it's the print media or the electronic media, critiques and criticisms of Israel. So part of what I feel my role as a rabbi is to help people to understand what goes on behind the headlines, to help people to understand the kinds of things that perhaps aren't out there right front and center. So as a result of those things, getting back to your earlier question, I think that our congregation, we certainly have liberals, we have people of all ilks in the congregation, but I do think that it is probably more centrist than many, and it's an interesting composition. I'll give you a couple of examples, if I may. Just recently, I spoke about the situation of the Syrian refugees. And I gave a sermon in which I spoke and I said, we absolutely as Jews have an imperative to remember that we were once strangers, to remember our historical experience, and to understand the importance of compassion. I said, but on the other hand, we also need to be conscious of in addition to our obligation to have compassion and open our doors to refugees, also to recognize the anti-Semitic environment in which most of these people were raised, in which all of them were raised, the anti-democratic environment, and that there needs to be a proper process to have a cautionary note. And so I try to balance both
That's
sides.
a very courageous stand for you to take.
Well, it was interesting because, I've heard from people on both sides of it. And interestingly, by the way, I've also heard, came back to me, somebody said that I took a position saying we should let all the refugees in, and somebody said they thought I took a position saying we should let no refugees in.
They had both heard the same sermon.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
So it's, I was wondering where I was when I was giving that sermon. I don't know. But at any rate, I think one of the keys, though, Mark, is to be respectful. And I think you can take a position if you allow for the fact that there are other positions out there. So if I may, in regard to Iran, on the high holidays, I decided not to speak about it. First of all, the situation was already, it had already been resolved by that time. And second of all, I didn't think that, I did not want to politicize something that had become so politicized. And so I actually announced the congregation because I thought some people might be expecting that I would speak about Iran. And I announced it. I said, I just want to let you all know that I'm not giving a sermon this high holidays about Iran. I said, and also the other big news at the time, the big story was Ashley Madison, that website for people who were interested in cheating and having affairs. And so I said, I also want to let you know, in addition to not speaking about Iran, I'm not speaking about Ashley Madison. But I did think about speaking about the two together, about how Iran is going to cheat. So that would have been the sermon I would have given. But what happened was, as I said, it was already done. But Yom Kippur afternoon, when we, as many synagogues, have an open conversation, we spoke about it then. And in addition to that, when the president asked to be able to speak to the American Jewish community, I provided that. And I said to our congregation, that link, and I said, I have lobbied against this bill. I have opposed it. I've spoken to every member of the Maryland delegation in Congress. I said, but this is the President of the United States, and I think we have an obligation to hear the other side as well. So that's what I mean when I say, I think, everybody talks about being civil. Everyone talks about having derech eretz, having decency towards each other. That doesn't mean that we don't take positions. That doesn't mean that everyone agrees with each other. But it's how we present those kinds of things.
It can still be done with respect, can't it, Stuart?
So what happened was when we had that conversation, somebody actually asked a member of the synagogue afterwards. They said, well, what was the topic about? This came back to me, and they said, well, we talked about Iran. And they said, well, how could that happen? The rabbi clearly has a position. And did he let everyone speak? They said, absolutely, all sides were heard. And somebody said, well, how is that possible? And I was very flattered, if I may modestly say. Somebody said afterwards, well, you don't know our rabbi. And that was something, that was a statement, which was what I wanted to try and convey. That we don't have to shy away from positions, but we can, take positions. We have to look at the big picture of the Jewish people, I think is very important.
Okay. But we take one moment and develop the idea you have on the Iran deal. How did it happen that the American administration, the President of the United States, Secretary of State, really argued that this is a good deal when so many people look at this deal and feel that it does not prevent Iran ultimately from getting a nuclear weapon, but in fact paves the way. And you have already told us you were against the deal.
Yeah.
I know you're against the deal. I want to hear your analysis for how does it happen that smart, well-meaning people in our administration push this deal, and now we have it.
Yeah, I think it's a number of factors. I think for one thing, sometimes in Washington, something can carry on a momentum of its own. I think there was a desire on the part of the president for legacy purposes, possibly. I think giving perhaps the benefit of the doubt, maybe he thought this will resolve the problem for this time and so on. At the risk of sounding critical, I think there was a certain naivete on the part of some of those who were involved in the negotiations. We saw what happened with North Korea, and incidentally, the same individual, Wendy Sherman, a member of the community, negotiated that treaty as well. I think that there was a situation in which the Iranians really just outmaneuvered us in terms of the bargains and bargaining table. We can't forget the fact they were the ones who invented the shuk and the Persian market. And I think that we really just got the administration and its supporters were so focused on getting this deal done that it just began to take on a momentum of its own.
Well said. And we should let our audience have a sense of where you stand on the political spectrum. Did you grow up a Democrat?
Absolutely, yeah, yes.
Okay. And would you say that in general, and I'm not asking you which party did you vote for in every election, but is it fair to say that you grew up a traditional liberal democratic Jew?
Absolutely. In fact, I was a candidate for the Democratic National Convention in 1972. So I try to I try to live at the center, to live at the tension, as I said, in Judaism as well. And more often than I try to see the individual for the individual. So I'm very proud of the fact that the last 3 or 4 governors of Maryland, for example, we had a Republican governor, Bob Ehrlich. He was preceded by Governor Paris Glendening, who was Democratic. We've had Governor Martin O'Malley, and now we have Governor Hogan. And in each one of those, although with the exception of Governor Hogan, with whom I do have a relationship though, for each one of them I gave the invocation at their inauguration. And so I think that's, to me, what's significant. In other words, to be able to have access to the decision makers in our community, I feel very, very comfortable, and I'm very, very close, by the way. Probably one very close friend of mine is Steny Hoyer, the leader who I knew from back when I was at the University of Maryland. And he always loves to talk about the fact that we've known each other now for over 40 years.
To what extent are you at all, and again, I'm putting you on the spot, but it's a place you have been so often. To what extent are you critical of American Jewish leadership because they have been reluctant to take strong stands on some of the issues relating to the State of Israel? Some argue because they don't want to lose access to halls of power or to the White House. But there are many who have felt that, unlike yourself, there has not been a strong enough voice and a strong enough position taken by major Jewish leaders. And Stuart, I say on JBS all the time, I have enormous regard for so many of them. I love so many of them. It doesn't mean, however, that I always think they're doing the right thing. So I'm asking you, to what extent are you in any way disappointed with the way in which American Jewish leadership has failed to lead, especially on issues relating to the State of Israel?
Look, I think it's a very complex issue from a number of perspectives. For one, when you're in the White House, it is very intoxicating.
Isn't it?
It really is. And especially if you're sitting in the Roosevelt room where you just look there and you know there is history. And so when you get that invitation, as I did have on a number of occasions, on several occasions, I said I don't want to overplay it, and you've been called in for a briefing or you've been called in to be invited to a reception or things like that. It is, we Jews...
It's human nature, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I still don't think I've encountered someone who doesn't pinch himself and just say to himself, a pintaliyid. What am I? I'm a simple Jew.
Yes.
And here I am.
Yes.
So as a result, it is very difficult, I think, to, in the words of Elie Wiesel, speak truth to power. It is very difficult to stand up in that kind of a regard there. And I think there are times when we have been expressive. I just came back a couple of weeks ago from having led a rabbinic group of rabbis in Israel, in meetings in Israel, with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. We met with Naftali Bennett. We met with Michael Oren, Aliza Levy, a number of individuals. And there was a sense, especially Michael Oren, who's now a member of the Knesset, a former ambassador, who has written and has about this and has spoken about it, that we, being the American Jewish community, and therefore the American Jewish leadership as well, let them down. That they came to us with wall-to-wall opposition to the agreement with Iran. And we didn't necessarily pick up that gauntlet. Now, we have to recognize that in our community, there certainly are those who were supportive of it.
Absolutely.
And there were some who were supportive of it for positive reasons and because they really did honestly and sincerely feel that was the right way to curb Iranian.
Absolutely, very important.
And there may have been some who were, along the lines of what you have asked, just not wanting to butt heads with the administration. So I think we can divide those into two. For the first group, you can't have anything but tremendous respect and recognition and appreciation that we can disagree. But by the same token, we were presented with an issue which Israel had said is an existential threat to their existence. I would have liked to have seen a stronger across the board a response to it. I don't know how effective that would have been. After all, when a sitting president wants something, one of the things I understand was that President Obama worked harder and lobbied more on this than he did on health care. And so this was a gut issue for him that he really wanted to get through. I think there have been difficulties, obviously, in terms of the relationships that have existed, whether it's the current prime minister or not. I happen to subscribe to the notion that we support the democratically elected government of Israel, whether it's on the left or whether it's on the right. And I think that they have a right to feel that we let them down.
Mm-hmm. What do you feel about groups of rabbis who are now signing letters that are published in the New York Times and other publications in America, who take a very strong position against Israeli policy in general? And it's not simply, it's J Street.
Right.
But the reality is, Stuart, that there are many rabbis, and I believe they are absolutely sincere in their own view of what is good for the Jewish people in the state of Israel. But I sometimes worry they also don't have what you began this discussion with, the sense, the understanding that any criticism has to be made in the context of Ahavat Yisrael.
Right.
And Yisrael here, the love of Israel, both means the state and the people as a whole. But very often now, we will see, a letter signed by 100 rabbis, 500 rabbis, 1,000 rabbis.
Sure.
And it has a very critical nature to it. From your perspective, what's it mean and what's it say to you?
I find those things, those kinds of letters that you're referring to be upsetting and disturbing from a number of perspectives. First of all, if I'm upset with my wife, I'm not going to advertise someplace else that I'm upset with her. I'm going to talk with her quietly, in a way in which then the two of us are able to have that conversation. So I don't think public letters like that are really the effective or appropriate way to go. One of the things that we as Jews should always do, I think, is to have open conversations. I disagree, by the way, strongly with those who say that there isn't healthy debate in the American Jewish community. That is a charge that is often brought by the left and those who are critical of Israel. But if anything, they've been given platforms and they have plenty of opportunity.
Of course.
So I reject that notion. But I do think that it's appropriate for those kinds of conversations to go on in the context of the way that we always handle family conversations. So that's number one. Number two, at the risk of sounding overly critical here, I do think that there are sometimes a naivete in some of these critiques of Israel. Naivete in the sense of not taking into consideration some of the important factors of the kinds of situation that Israel, circumstances and surroundings that Israel is in, the kinds of existential threat that exist every single day to the state of Israel. And I think also one of the questions that rabbis need to ask themselves is, at the end of the day, is this something that I'm doing just to make me feel better, or is it really going to help Israel? Even if you happen to agree, let's just say that Israel should make more concessions, by publicly stating that, that does not strengthen Israel's hand. If anything, Israel is better able to make concessions. Israel is better able to be at the negotiating table when it is viewed as being strong, when it is viewed as having the support of the American Jewish community. And then finally, there's the way in which the non-Jewish community sometimes just gets finished and trying to understand. They can be confused. Well, what is the position here? I remember early on speaking with a member of Congress who had been a traditional supporter of Israel, and he says, this is about 5 or 6 years ago. Now I've heard from this new organization, J Street, and they telling me they're pro-Israel, but that I shouldn't be in favor of this or of that and so on. So I think that messaging becomes problematic. Now, again, they may feel that we are bringing the message that we believe to be right, but I think we have to have a better picture of the long-range view and not just of our own immediate concerns. What I mean by that is to be looking at the situation, as I said before, that Israel is in from a security perspective, to also take into consideration the reality of who Israel is dealing with. And so often, the judgments, the decisions we have, even by rabbis, are made based upon media images. Look, for example, during the Gaza war, the number of reporters, the number of reports that were given about every single bombing and things like that. Now, look what's going on in Syria. Look what's going on in so many other countries. There's absolutely no saturation coverage. There's minimal coverage at all. We have that hospital that was bombed in Afghanistan where the Doctors Without Borders were there, where there were tremendous civilian casualties. I still remember the harsh criticism, almost deeply visceral criticism by President Obama, by Secretary Kerry, saying Israel should do better, we expect better, and so on and so forth. I mean, it would be chutzpah if Prime Minister Netanyahu now were to go on and say, we expect better of America. And of course, he won't do that, nor should he do that. But my point is that we see this double standard, and it hurts us all the time.
What is it you think that most American Jews don't understand about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which you wish they would understand?
The thing that I wish people would understand is within the American Jewish community, is to understand these are decent, the soldiers are decent young men and women who are placed in very difficult situations, and they do the best they can, and they have a sense of humanity and decency. My son happened to have served in the IDF, by the way, for 2 years, and we spoke about the fact that before he ever first was able to carry a weapon, there was 6 months of training, and the training included them seeing the movie Apocalypse Now. And the reason they show the movie to the young Israeli soldiers is to say, this is what we want to make sure does not happen to us. And they have a code of ethics that they study, which is based on Talmudic law, and that there are, and you know, we look at what's happening in American cities right now, in the terms of the crime, and the way in which so many blacks are being shot by American police officers, whether without going into specifics of each individual situation. Israeli soldiers are trained to incapacitate someone. And so as I was watching some of these things with my son and talking with him about it, he keeps asking the question, why aren't they just shooting them in the leg? Why aren't they just shooting them in the arm to disarm them? Why are they shooting to kill? And so that's one of the things I wish people would be reminded of, and that is the decency, as well as especially in the face of such unbelievable circumstances, that and the humanity of Israel. It's in a sea of tyrannical regimes, of totalitarian countries, and yet somehow they maintain a vibrant democracy. They maintain Jewish values. I think that's part of the message I wish people understood.
Also, there is a great deal of self-criticism inside the State of Israel.
Absolutely.
It's not like if American Jews don't criticize Israel, Israel doesn't know what criticism is, yes?
Yeah, it is amazing to see the nature of the critique that goes on. We have, in Israel, there's a program called Eretz Nehederet, which is a satirical show, very similar to Saturday Night Live. And there they take on the government all the time, as does the media, almost every single publication, as does almost every single taxi driver as well.
Yes.
So it's not as if that discussion is stifled there.
And you understand most American Jews either have never been to Israel or have only been there as tourists.
Right.
They don't understand what it is to live day by day by day in the State of Israel and how complicated the issues are dealing with Arab Israelis or Arab Palestinians, nor do they have a real sense of the extent to which, while it may very well be true that Arabs are second-class citizens in the State of Israel, at the same time, the things Israel has done on behalf of its work with Arab Israelis and Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza is extraordinary.
And part of the proof of that is when there are surveys that are asked of Arab Israelis, would you rather be a part of an Arab Palestinian state or stay a part of the State of Israel? Overwhelmingly, they always say they would prefer to be a part of the State of Israel. Yes. So when you talk about the issues there, I think it would be helpful for people to know, in addition to what we say about geography and the decency, in addition to that, to know the history. History both of the risks that Israel has taken, history in the terms of the concessions Israel has made, that are unprecedented. When Israel gave the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula, to Egypt, that was 2/3 of its landmass at that time. This is extraordinary. When they evicted and they took all of the citizens out of Gaza who were Israelis, that was also unprecedented. So Israel has taken risks for peace. So when you ask what is it I wish that we would do. I wish that those American Jewish organizations or individuals who are harshly critical of Israel would be equally harshly critical of the Palestinian side, and equally demanding of them that they make concessions, equally demanding of them that they renounce terrorism, that they renounce the incitement. So when we look at the situation, it becomes a very difficult one to solve, in part because of the way in which people are so indoctrinated. And it's no coincidence, therefore, that in the 53 Muslim nations, that the rate of anti-Semitism is probably the lowest rate of any of the countries, would be 90%, and most it's between 95 to 98%. That's extraordinary. I wonder if anti-Semitism was even that high in Nazi Germany. And so all of this is an indoctrination and a mindset which has to be broken. We have to break through that.
You say it beautifully. If someone were here with us right now who saw things differently, this is what they'd say to you. I understand everything, Stuart, but the reality is Israel is the powerful one in relation to the Palestinians.
Sure.
And that we expect more of Israel. Don't tell me the Palestinians should act as Israelis, because they're never going to. At the same time, it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is you, the Israeli, and you, the Jew, or we, the Israeli and the Jew. We have the power, and at the moment we are treating other human beings in ways that we would not want to be treated. We are an occupying nation. There are roadblocks which make it very difficult for Palestinians to travel from their home to where they work, from the home to their orchard. We are making life, we are humiliating them, we are not giving them enough freedom, and we are refusing to make the ultimate compromises which would bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And therefore, I don't want to talk about the past. I often hear that. Don't talk to me about history. I only want to talk about what is now. And what is now is Israelis have guns that kill Palestinians and make their lives less than human. And you as a Jew shouldn't be talking about a double standard, because nobody in the world is going to be the West or America or Israel. The question is Israel doing what it should do in terms of its own sense of self and what you would want the Jewish state to do? This is what somebody sitting here would say. You've heard it. Absolutely. What's your answer?
I've had those conversations. I would say several things. I'd say, first of all, Israel itself judges itself by a high standard, and it tries to maintain that. But no society, no people is perfect. Again, we look at America. It is an unbelievably wonderful country, and yet we certainly have pockets of violence, pockets of intolerance, and things like that. Similarly, within Israel, there are exceptions to that. One of the things that's so important, though, is how does the society, how does the government, how does the people themselves deal with these aberrations? And there we see that they are not praised. It's not as if there are schools that are named after them. It's not as if there are public squares that are named after them. You know, Baruch Goldstein, who committed a massacre in the Hebron mosque, Israel has seen to it that his grave is not marked, precisely because they don't want it to become a place of pilgrimage. And so there's the important thing in terms of how the society responds. That's not to say it's going to be perfect. But the other part of the equation is that having been to Israel as many times as I have, which is between 40 to 50 times, usually a couple of times a year I'll be in Israel usually, and knowing the Israelis as well as I do, and having spoken with Israeli government individuals and members of the press on all sides of the perspective there is an overwhelming desire for peace, an overwhelming desire for accommodation and for all of these kinds of things. And I think Israel would make concessions in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, where are the people on the other side to be able to make those deals, to be able to come?
Is there someone on the other side?
At present, no. And again, part of it is because the leadership has chosen to foment incitement rather than to plant seeds of tolerance. They've chosen to encourage extremism rather than to plant the fact that there will be a need for accommodation and concessions. Israeli leaders across the board consistently have helped to prepare their people for the fact that one day there will need to be concessions, as there have been concessions. Almost every prime minister has said, we're not going to get everything, they're not going to get everything. I think when we have an Arab leader, a Palestinian leader, who says that to his people in their language, in Arabic, that's when we'll be able to have the beginning of progress.
Are the Jewish people, is the state of Israel prepared to share the land between the river and the sea?
From conversations that I've had, it would be there are those who would be reluctant to do so, but if it would bring peace and if it would help to resolve the conflict, absolutely.
Absolutely. Is there anybody in the Palestinian leadership who's ready to share the land between the river and the sea?
That's one of the reasons.
Is there?
Not that I'm aware of. And
the answer is no.
Yeah.
You know it's no.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why Prime Minister Netanyahu introduced this notion, which many, again, American Jews did not always understand, but introduced the notion that with the negotiations, with the discussion, there has to be, number one, a cessation of violence. Number two, there has to be an end of claims. In other words, you can't have peace with us and then use that peace to keep bringing claims against us. And the third point is that this is why Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted upon recognition of Israel as a Jewish state.
Absolutely.
And many people don't realize that. People, and Abbas and Saeb Erekat, will laughingly dismiss it, saying, call yourself whatever you want. What difference does it make what we call you? But it does make a difference.
Of course.
It makes a difference because they need to be able to recognize that there is a Jewish claim to the land. Just as Israelis have recognized that there is a justification for the existence of a Palestinian state, and which I certainly recognize as well and agree with, that if that brings peace, then let us move in that direction without question. But by the same token, they need to recognize this. And that's why, the thing about the Al-Aqsa Mosque is so important, and the Temple Mount, where Arafat and others, ever since him, have denied the fact that there was any Jewish presence there, that there was any Jewish existence in the land of Israel, which is absurd. That's why that issue is important.
Okay. To tie this to the fact that, again, you are a rabbi in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
area, to me it is so simple. You have two parties. One party says we'll share the land. One party says over my dead body. And until both sides say they'll share the land, it's not about where you draw a line. It's not about a border. It's not about settlements. It's not about occupation. One group is saying we will never share the land with the Jewish state. You're a Washington rabbi. How in the world doesn't the President of the United States and the Secretary of State understand this?
So I think you have to ask them. You can't ask me. I can't speak for
Yes,
them.
I'm asking you. You have an instinct. What's your instinct here?
My instinct is that they have a whole different perception of the Middle East and of the world realpolitik. We have a president who wanted to pull back American involvement in the Middle East. With the red line, we saw what happened there. I think we have a president who is not willing to necessarily go that extra step in terms of recognizing the very things that you've said. I think he has a whole different world perception. And Kerry, his Secretary of State, buys into that as well. And I think there goes back to what we talked about earlier, a certain naivete. And that is, gee, if everyone just gave in a little bit, I think there's a lack of recognition and lack of understanding of what they're dealing with. I think it goes back to your earlier question. It's one of the reasons why they were able to negotiate this Iran deal that they came up with. And I think it's one of the reasons why they have a different mindset about how to deal with the situation in the Middle East. It's very, very disappointing for somebody like you and like me who realizes and feels that it's also very obvious. And that's part of the frustration that we bear. But I will say this, and that is, just because the administration may feel that way and may pursue that kind of a policy, and they might even question whether or not they would agree with the assumption, by the way, does not mean that the overwhelming number of Democrats in Congress concur and agree with them. I think time and time again, I do hear from Democratic members of Congress that they are concerned about the president's tilt, that they're concerned actually about the impact that it will have upon the long-standing relationship between the Jewish community and the Democratic Party.
Okay.
So I think that's an important factor.
Okay. I want to go on record with you.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, I have an enormous respect for you personally, but I also understand the position you hold. I don't think it's being said strongly enough and simply enough by American Jewry and by rabbis of your stature. The problem is no more complicated than this. Two parties both say they want the land. Both feel they have a right to the land. Jews feel we have a right to all of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, the Palestinians tell me they feel they have the right to the land as well because it was conquered one time under Muslim rule. Okay, both people will have a claim to the land. One group says, given the modern world, the way you resolve this problem is you compromise. Mm-hmm. You share the land. Now there'll be a question where you draw the line but all that becomes easy if there's a concept shared by both. We will share the land. One side in this controversy says we will share the land, and one side says, no, we won't. Everything else is obfuscation. This has nothing to do with settlements, nothing to do with occupation, nothing to do with roadblocks, nothing to do with... One side says we'll share, and one side says, why should we share? It's all ours. And as long as that's the mindset of Palestinian leadership, there's not a way in the world, you know this, there's not a way in the world any peace can be made. And ultimately, the American administration has to understand that, and the Jewish community has to stand up. Israel has to say it, and American Jewry has to say it. So I'm saying to you, I want Stuart Weinblatt. Now, in some way, that becomes our mantra. The problem here is one side will share one, and I believe, the reason why I feel so passionate about this, the only chance I believe we have of changing Palestinian strategy, if not ideology, is if they understand we get it.
Absolutely.
And they understand that the American administration gets it. And that the get is, if you're not willing to share the land, you can't have our American support. You can't have American support if you say no Jews may live on a new Palestinian state. Sure. You may not have our support if you say you will never share the land with a legitimate Jewish state of Israel.
Sure. So let's not forget, the very first call that was President Obama made in the Oval Office after being inaugurated to a foreign leader was not to the head of any country, but rather was to Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. The first country that he visited was Turkey. That was followed by a visit to Egypt. And he was advised by his national security advisor, we now know in Dennis Ross's recent book, not to bother to go to Israel. And so my point is that there was a different orientation. There was a sense of trying to break away from where the Bush administration had been and aligning itself so closely with Israel. We can see that hasn't helped. The truth of the matter is that the greatest progress is made when Israel and the United States are aligned. For whatever reason, this administration came in with a different mindset and has continued to pursue that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that when we have this sense of an appreciation of who it is that's willing to make the compromises, who it is that's willing to really, sincerely take the risks for peace, that the United States should be much more demonstrative. Look, Martin Indyk was involved on the ground on negotiations, and afterwards, what did he do? He condemned Israel.
Yes.
And yet we know that during the time of Ehud Barak's administration, as well as Ehud Olmert's, that there were plans for between 95 to 98%. And you know, there's something called game theory. I learned this actually from one of my kids who took a course in college about this. And that is the person who is unreasonable ultimately will be the person who will be get more. So by being unreasonable, what's happening is we are rewarding that side that's being unreasonable. Instead of saying to them, 95%, that's a hell of a good bargain. 98%, that's pretty good. You're not going to get much more than that. But we haven't done that. And instead, we have blamed Israel, say, well, you know, it really was your fault, and it is the settlements and things like that. The settlements would stop. When I mentioned to you earlier that I met with the Palestinian ambassador of the United States, and I said to him, I said, you know, if you guys are really so concerned about the expansion of settlements, I would think that's the incentive that you should come to the peace table and negotiate that much quicker. It's as if I'm a real estate mogul, and you want this part of the land, and I've got up to here, and I keep building out here to here. That means if I'm on the other end, I'm going to need to come that much quicker before it's too late. And so somehow that hasn't quite kicked in.
Yes. I also want to make sure you and I don't believe that Israel is doing this. Most Israeli building in settlements right now is inside existing blocks. It's vertical. It's not horizontal.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And under this prime minister, by the way, there has not been an expansion of settlements, contrary to the way it's been presented.
Yes. And I don't ever see that said honestly in the media.
Yeah.
I don't have a sense that the media understands this at all.
People come to things with a preset notion, and then they merely just apply it to the current reality, whether it's true or not. There are people who will just assume, Netanyahu is building and expanding settlements, when exactly what you said a moment ago, what I said as well, is the case, and that is that they have not been expanded.
Okay. We are in, at the moment, a presidential campaign.
Sure.
As we sit here, it looks as if Hillary Clinton will be the nominee of the Democratic Party, and it looks as if the Republicans are still nowhere near picking a candidate. So I don't want to talk about personalities. From your perspective, does the ideology of either party play an important role? Would you like it to play? Should it play an important role in an American Jew's decision if for that American Jew, one of the most important priorities when they pick a president and an administration is the way in which the United States of America will interact with the State of Israel?
Absolutely. Look, as participants in the democratic process, we absolutely have a right to have whatever issue is at the fore and is the most important to us as our primary concern and consideration. There are those for whom abortion will be their number one issue. Gesundheit, hey, let them go on that issue. There are those for whom gun control, and they won't care how anybody votes on other issues. We, as a small minority, have a role to play, and I think that role can be very helpful, and ultimately will help in terms of the context of what we've talked about earlier, of bringing about peace, bringing about a greater cooperation in the Middle East, when the United States is supportive, when there is no daylight between the United States and Israel. So if your question is, should that play a role in how we decide, I always urge my congregants, and I speak about it, and that is that when you cast your vote as a Jew, which means, is it good for the Jews? Is it good for Israel? And I'm not going to say which candidate or which party is necessarily that, but I want that thought process to be front and center. And I spoke actually the last two presidential cycles on the eve of those elections in the high holidays about making sure that those are issues. And I said I want the Democratic Party nominees' best advisors and closest friends and supporters and biggest supporters to be Jews, and whoever the Republican nominee is, I want that as well, so that we do have that opportunity to have access, so we do have that opportunity to discuss these issues with them. We all know the very famous story about Harry Truman, when it was his former business partner who came to see him and begged him to meet with Chaim Weizmann, and started crying when in the meeting in the White House, and Truman couldn't turn him down, and that of course helped to affect the course of history. So domestic issues, similarly, I hope people look at it from a Jewish filter, and you can come to different conclusions. But let our Jewish values be a part of who we are. Let it play a part in our everyday lives. Let it play a part in how we make our political judgments as well. And I think that when we take that into consideration, Israel, certainly because of its precarious existence, because of us being such a small minority, we have a right to make that a top priority. Not just a right, I would say we have an obligation to do that.
You're absolutely fabulous. And the work you're doing for the Jewish community and the Jewish world, Yotzei min hakol. And it's wonderful to be able to have this kind of conversation with somebody who is as involved and committed as you are. Yasher koach to you. I'm going to ask you to join me again to do nothing but talk about this book. Can I ask you to do that?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Sure.
So thank you. Stuart's going to stay with me, and we're going to just continue the conversation. In the meantime, as always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have heard Stuart discuss as we talked about the state of Israel and the issues confronting Jewish life and Israel. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And again, I hope you'll join me next time when I continue the conversation with Stuart Weinblatt. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.